James walked Emily to the door as she headed off to work. He did not even have the chance to feel truly upset about being left home alone again. They had been together for over 10 years, but he still had not learned how to take it personally when she went on another business trip. He had gotten used to it. It was nothing unusual. She worked for a large company, and business trips, trainings, and meetings had become a routine part of their life. She left her coffee mug in the kitchen, pretending to be in a hurry. She kissed him goodbye one more time, without passion, but without coldness either. Just like always. He stood up from the couch, picked up a newspaper, opened it to a random page, but his thoughts drifted somewhere far away. A few hours passed. Once again, he found himself alone in the apartment. The silence settled in, not the kind that exists when nobody speaks, but a calm kind of silence, the kind that comes with certainty. He knew that when she returned from work, she would have dinner, change clothes, wash the dishes, and fall asleep. And he would go back to reading the paper, listening to the radio, or simply staring out the window. Life would carry on along its usual path. Like always, that evening, when he'd already run out of things to do, his phone suddenly vibrated. A familiar, unhurried call. James assumed it was her again, checking in as usual. "Hey, James, it's Michael. You weren't expecting me, were you?" Had a few drinks, dialed the wrong number. The voice was hesitant, but there was a trace of irony slipping through, too raw to be fully hidden by alcohol. "You know where she is, right?" Michael continued without waiting for a response. James froze, silently gripping the phone. He waited to hear what else this drunken voice had to say. Michael clearly had no idea that his words had just tumbled out like some careless accident. "Emily's in Dubai with the boss. A villa, I swear, just not what you were expecting." And then, as if trying to convince himself, Michael spat out the words that hit James like a bullet. The boss and Emily. James had the urge to hang up, but instead, he felt a cold rush crawl down his spine. He closed his eyes. Everything suddenly became irrelevant. The strange chill in his chest vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and there was no rage, only emptiness. Slowly, without drama, he turned off the phone. No emotions. He did not even know what he was feeling at that moment. He sank into the chair, leaning back. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but to James, time seemed to stop. He could not even label the call as important. Just words, careless, random, that had changed his life in a way he had somehow always suspected. From the first glance, pure instinct, James sat in the dark shadow of the room. No tears, no outbursts, no fights. Nothing. Just silence. And a gut feeling that this was not news. It was a truth he had long known. He no longer needed proof to understand he had been betrayed. Why destroy something that had already been falling apart? This was just another confirmation that things were not what they seemed. But now it was over. James sat in his chair, resting his cheek on his hand. He was enveloped not in physical darkness, but in a kind of emotional shadow. Like the entire world had slipped behind a closed door, and he remained alone, listening to the noise inside his own mind. Time felt suspended, but the moments filled with silence sounded like static buzzing underneath his thoughts. It had not started this way. Once, they had met by chance at a corporate event James attended as a guest of a friend. She had come with a colleague, and he was there with a co-worker. Their eyes met across the room, and in that instant, James understood that everything before that moment no longer mattered. She was with him, just like that, just a look that said more than words ever could. The rest was just noise. She, like him, was searching for something more than what everyday life had to offer. She worked as an accountant for a small firm, but always dreamed of something bigger. James remembered her smile when she talked about her ambitions, when she got the offer from a big company. It was as if she had come alive again. Her eyes lit up, and James had listened with genuine joy to her talk about career growth. It was around that time he began to feel that he meant something to her. What he did not know then was that her ambitions went beyond just work. She was in love with her job the way James was in love with her. And the moment she was promoted, their cozy little apartment began to feel too small for her. That was when James decided it was time to take the next step, build something bigger. He worked tirelessly, never slowing down, juggling multiple jobs, so she could live comfortably. He renovated the apartment, bought a new car, and planned small weekend getaways. It was all for her. He wanted to give her what he had never had growing up. Emily always said she was not used to such things. And James tried to make everything just right. A brand new couch, a proper table, a fridge stocked with her favorite food. But it was complicated. Work consumed so much of her time. And even though he was there, present, something between them had already begun to drift apart. Little by little, James started noticing odd things. At first, just minor details, nothing alarming, just enough to make him think. Unusual business trips, rarely taking vacation time, and never in sync with his own schedule. When he asked, she always replied with confidence, just another hectic month. She always claimed she did not have time, but somehow, her messages to colleagues included strange phrases like, "I can't wait for this trip with him," or "You know how much this means." James ignored it. He trusted her. He never checked her phone, never read her texts, never searched her computer. He believed in her. He loved her. And he never wanted to be one of those men who hover by the door with suspicion, dissecting every word for lies. James was convinced that trust was the foundation of any relationship. He worked for both of them, aimed for stability, and believed that with this woman, he could build the life he had dreamed of. But with each passing year, something kept going wrong. She became increasingly busy, and it seemed his life was slowly fading into the background of her priorities. The little gifts she brought from work no longer felt sweet. They were perfumes he had not bought. They smelled unlike her usual taste. She had always loved floral scents, but now they were sharp, foreign, nothing major. Yet the tiny details started to fill the void. James noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about some new project, only to follow it with an apology. She could not join him on vacation. How she avoided talking about her co-workers. How she no longer explained why she was always traveling with the same people. Fewer and fewer outings with friends. And when she did go out, her stories about the trips became vague. His concern turned slowly into tension. Tension he tried to hide but could no longer suppress. Now, sitting in the dark, he recalled it all. Each memory, a puzzle piece. And suddenly, the whole picture came together. The betrayal had always been there. And James finally realized he had been living a lie for a long time. A simple truth, but now painfully obvious. James found himself wandering from room to room. His bedroom, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Seeking corners where her presence no longer lingered. He knew Emily would return soon, but he had no idea how to act when she did. The entire day passed in a fog, with memories and questions circling in his head. Questions he had not yet dared to ask. His fingers tightened around his phone. He dialed the number of her friend, Sophie. He thought he might casually ask about Emily, maybe bring it up like it was nothing, just to see if Sophie would try to hide something. "Hey, Sophie, it's James. Have you seen Emily by any chance?" She hasn't responded. "Kinda weird," he said, deliberately slowing his speech to sound casual, like he was just calling to chat. There was a pause. First, James heard a faint cough, then hesitation. Hey, Sophie finally responded. "No, haven't seen her today." "That's odd. Maybe she's just busy, you know. Where is she now, do you know?" "Oh, just some work trip." "Same as usual," James replied, his voice calm, even a little cold. Sophie went silent again, and in James' ears that silence roared. Why the hesitation? What was she hiding? Why such a strange pause? He had always known Sophie to be upfront with him, but now something felt off. Why had she not told him the truth? Why that awkward tone in her voice? "Don't worry, James. I'm sure everything's fine." "She'll be back soon," Sophie added with a nervous chuckle, before quickly ending the call. James set the phone down on the table. Inside, a strange emptiness was growing, as if this single conversation had become another puzzle piece, one that made everything clearer than he wanted. He sat there thinking. He knew he still did not have all the answers. Not yet. He needed more proof. A few minutes later, he dialed the next number, his mother-in-law. He had always had a friendly relationship with her, and James needed another opinion, another angle. Maybe she would say something Sophie hadn't. "Hey, Mom, how are you? Do you happen to know where Emily is?" She hasn't replied. "It's just kind of weird," he asked with feigned lightness, masking the storm behind his words. "Hi, James. Everything's fine. She's on a business trip. Just like always. Don't worry," she replied, calm and steady. But her tone, it was too firm. James picked up on it instantly. "I'm not worried. Just checking in to see if everything's all right," he said, hiding the tension creeping into his chest. The call ended. He sat still, listening to the silence left in its wake. The strange questions would not stop spinning in his mind. Why had no one told him the truth? Why even her mother, who used to share everything, was now silent? This was not normal. A wave of cold anger started to rise in him. That old sense of resolve he used to feel when facing a tough problem. It returned. James was an engineer. He made plans. Logical, clean-cut, precise plans. He had no intention of losing control. No, if he acted on emotion, he knew he would make mistakes. He needed to be silent, methodical. He needed to gather facts. Quietly, step by step, he sat in thought. He knew Emily's weak spots. He knew which phrases tripped her up, how she reacted under pressure, how she panicked when things stopped making sense. She was not as composed as she wanted the world to believe, and that was his advantage. He would not rush. He would not jump to conclusions. He believed in facts. He always had. All he needed to do was collect the pieces, without emotion. Emotion got in the way. His eyes drifted toward the phone again, then to the photos on the wall. Pictures of her. Of them. These memories meant nothing now. Everything had changed. He no longer wanted answers from her. He wanted to take back everything she had destroyed. Slowly, carefully, precisely. James sat in the dim light of the living room. He did not know what to do with the feelings that had overwhelmed him after those phone calls. Everything around him looked the same. The furniture, the books, even the smell of the apartment. But something in the air had shifted. With every hour, it became harder to pretend that nothing had changed. He was not ready to confront Emily yet. He knew talking to her would be useless. Words meant nothing now. He needed to know more, to see the full picture. The house was filled with little things. Old photographs, letters, documents that had accumulated over the years, each one a fragment of their life together. Now he stood at a crossroads. Turn a blind eye or keep digging. He opened her closet. Beneath the dresser was a box she always said was for special things. Inside were vacation photos, diplomas, little trinkets she had collected on business trips. But among these harmless memories, he spotted an old notebook, black, worn with stains on the cover. He knew it was her journal. She had kept one for years, but never allowed him to read it. That was her private world. James opened the notebook, and his heart tightened. At first, it was filled with work notes, to-do lists, vague ideas about the future. But then, several pages stood out. The tone was different. The handwriting was hers, but what she had written was deeply unsettling. He flipped to a page and stopped cold. His breath caught in his throat. "You are my real one. With James, it's just pity. I can't keep playing this game. But I won't leave him. He doesn't deserve that. I'll do whatever it takes not to lose him, even if it means continuing to lie." James froze in place. These words cut through him like a blade. He reread them, again and again. It felt like someone had ripped his heart out and shattered it into pieces. But inside, there was no panic, just emptiness. It was not even a surprise. Somewhere deep down, he had always known she had been hiding something. But this was brutally honest. His entire world cracked open. Every word in that journal, every sentence, was proof that her betrayal was not a slip, not a moment of weakness. It had been a deliberate, ongoing affair. For years. Suddenly, everything made sense. All the strange business trips, the distant looks, the untraceable gifts. She had built a second life alongside his. And everything James thought he had already lost long before realizing it. There, among dusty photos and empty pages, James felt his chest collapsing on itself. It was like an emotional heart attack. Everything it held inside, everything it bottled up, burst out, not in rage, not in tears, but in silence. Just quiet, heavy breathing as he watched his life crumble in stillness. And yet he remained calm. James knew he could not afford to lose it. This was not like in the movies. He would not rush to confront her, shouting and sobbing. No, it was simpler than that. Much simpler. He kept reading. More pages. She wrote about how hard it was to keep the secret, how guilt kept her up at night. But there were no words of love, no feelings, just calculation. Everything he read painted her not as a confused woman caught in emotional turmoil, but as a player in a game in which he was just a pawn. James closed the notebook gently. He held it in his hands, unsure what to do with it. But one thing was clear. There was no point in having a conversation with her now. It was too obvious. He felt no rage, no hate, just clarity. She had betrayed him, but that was no longer frightening. It was simply reality. Now, the only thing left to do was continue living. Without her, Emily kept sending her usual messages from the business trip. James knew she would be back tomorrow, just like always. The same empty phrases she used every time she left for another corporate tour. Back-to-back meetings, she wrote. A plain message, to which James calmly replied with his typical, okay. Then came, I'll be home tomorrow night, as if it were a promise. But in James' eyes, it was anything but that. The words felt empty, repetitive, like she had said them 1,000 times before. With each repetition, they lost more meaning. He responded the way she expected him to, calmly, like always. But inside, everything had changed. He felt no pain, no rage, just a deepening void. But it was not despair, it was strategy. Everything that was happening, he endured without panic, without a word. In silence, James no longer searched her messages for truth. He did not question her. He knew there was no way she could earn back his trust. That part was over. What mattered now was the next step. He was preparing. He sat at his computer, reviewing files. No frantic moves. Everything methodical like clockwork. He began changing passwords on all his accounts. He filled out forms, documents he'd ignored for years, knowing they now played a vital role. He opened a new bank account. Quietly, he started transferring money from their shared savings. Everything had to be ready for her return. James had no intention of making decisions driven by emotion. He was an engineer. He believed in precision. He knew that to avoid mistakes, you had to act like a machine, disconnected from bitterness. So slowly, he worked through each task. Every step was carefully calculated. Emily suspected nothing. She carried on with work, her messages as impersonal as ever. No sign of emotion, not a single honest line. Just more excuses, more logistical details. She was convinced she was still in control, but in truth, her entire reality was falling apart. James knew the worst thing he could do now was rush into confrontation. He had already made up his mind. He would act with cold, deliberate intent. When she returned, there would be no need to explain himself. It would all speak for itself. He was going to quietly, methodically dismantle her illusion of security. No anger, just consequences. A week passed. Each day, James did not touch her things, did not search for more evidence. He had everything he needed. All he had to do was wait. Wait for her to walk through the door. Everything he did was like building a structure, a new foundation, brick by brick. Not out of love, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. A new life would begin, and it would not include her. Emily returned home late in the evening, just as she always did. James was sitting on the couch, gazing out the window, watching the darkness settle outside. He did not immediately notice when the door opened softly behind him. Her return followed the usual routine, the same careful steps, the same quiet movements. She entered, standing by the doorway, slipping off her coat, and immediately launched into her usual fuss. She placed her suitcase down, started unpacking. She pulled out a souvenir from the trip, a magnet from Dubai, with colorful towers, desert sand, and blue waves. Just as he expected. The familiar, "Hi, honey," with a forced smile. A kiss on the cheek, barely there, like part of a morning checklist. She glanced at him, tired, but with a bit of sparkle in her eyes. He was right there, unmoved, watching silently, as though waiting for something. Maybe he was even searching her face for something he could no longer recognize. No matter how hard she tried to appear attentive, no matter how much she smiled or tried to play her part, James saw only one thing. He saw her trying, but there was no sincerity in it, just muscle memory, an act she had long rehearsed. The fussing, the smiles, the polite gestures, a mask she had clearly worn for years. He continued watching her in silence. The more he looked, the clearer it became. This was not the woman he had once fallen in love with. Emily busily unpacked her suitcase, hurriedly flipping through items, pulling out souvenirs, arranging her cosmetics. It was routine to her. But James felt no warmth in any of it. Everything she did felt mechanical, lifeless, as if her body was here, but her mind was elsewhere, far from him. She tried to talk about her meetings, how she had missed home. James listened, but he did not hear her. He focused on her movements, her gestures, how she reached to hang her coat, how she squinted slightly as she arranged her things. And in his head, her journal echoed, "With James, it's just pity." Those words replayed in rhythm with her every action, like a dark, twisted soundtrack. She, of course, had no idea that he knew. She did not see how he studied her every move, how he had already detached from the reality she believed they still shared. Her words had no truth. Her eyes had no soul. She kissed him on the cheek, and he felt nothing. Later that evening, as always, she went to shower. After a long trip, she left her half-empty teacup on the table and headed to the bathroom. James remained in the living room, sitting exactly where he had been, still, silent. He could not keep pretending that things would ever go back to how they were. He could no longer lie to himself that she was the same person who had stood by his side all these years. Everything had changed. When she shut the bathroom door behind her, James looked at her things, her clothes on the chair, her perfume bottle on the table. But he did not move toward them. He did not touch anything. He simply sat, staring at the space she had occupied moments before, as if her very presence had become foreign. Slowly, everything about their home began to feel foreign, like he was no longer in his home, but in some strange place that used to feel familiar. When she emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, with hair clinging to her shoulders, she returned to her routine. She sat down on the couch, flipping through a magazine, not saying much, like everything was fine. But James no longer saw her as his wife. He sensed her, but he no longer felt her. That was the moment he realized something crucial. She was no longer the woman he loved. James sat in the kitchen, calmly stirring his coffee. There was no rush in his movements. He knew Emily needed time to settle in, to wander through the apartment, drop her bag, take a shower, straighten things up. Everything was unfolding just like it always did. He sat there, staring into the dark window, where the distant lights of the city blinked softly. In that silence, everything felt in place, and his inner world was just as calm and hollow as those distant lights. No anger, no pain, just emptiness, as if every last emotion had been burned out, leaving only cold calculation. When Emily returned from the bathroom, she walked through the living room and into the kitchen. James was already standing with a cup in his hand, looking at her, expressionless. She noticed something different about him, subtle but undeniable. She just did not know what it meant yet. "You're up early," she said, lifting her eyebrows, attempting to lighten the mood with her usual gentle smile. James quietly placed the cup on the table and looked at her. It was not a look of blame, not pain either. It was a kind of look that asked, silently, "Do you still think I do not know?" "I know everything," he said, his voice calm and steady. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion, but each word echoed in the silence of the kitchen. She froze. Her hand, holding the coffee mug, stopped in midair. At first, she laughed nervously, convinced he was joking. "Are you serious? What are you talking about?" She chuckled, trying to dismiss it, taking a sip as if everything was fine. But James did not smile. He just kept staring at her, unblinking. His eyes were cold, like ice. No fury, no judgment. Just the stillness of someone who already knows the truth. His silence was more terrifying than any scream. Emily's face went pale. Her laughter died instantly, and something inside her tightened. Her eyes flickered with confusion, and she took a small step backward, as if trying to escape his gaze. You mean you knew?" she asked, her voice shaking, barely audible. She was still searching for an excuse, still hoping to pull together some explanation, but James' silence confirmed it all. She could feel it. He said nothing, just stared, steady, unyielding. She sat down on a chair, lowered her head, and pressed her hands to her face. Tears welled in her eyes, but she was still trying to hold herself together to not appear weak. "I don't know how this happened. I can't believe it," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She could not find the right words. She just cried, not from guilt, not from shame, but because she had lost control, lost something she once believed was hers. James did not move. He stood in place, watching her as though she were a stranger. He did not react to her tears. He knew they were not apologies, not remorse. They were a reflex, a last-ditch effort to win him back. But he was no longer the man who could be won. "You do not understand what you've done," he said, without raising his voice. Calmly, "I am not kicking you out, but you are nothing to me now." Her eyes locked onto his face. She had no words. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "You can stay the night," he added with the same quiet tone. "Tomorrow we file for divorce." She stood frozen, fists clenched, her mind spinning. She had expected anything. Tears screaming, begging, but not this deadly calm. His voice did not tremble. His expression never changed. That was what broke her. James turned and walked to his room. He did not look back. Emily stood alone in the kitchen, unable to move, as if rooted to the floor. Her thoughts were a loud, panic blur. She did not know how to fix this. Everything had crumbled in a single moment, and there was no fury, no hate, just as cold, terrifying calm. He closed the door behind him, and everything was decided. Morning arrived without a sound. James woke up early, long before Emily came out of the bathroom. He already knew what needed to be done. There was no panic, no hesitation. He was calmer than ever. Every step had been thought through, like moves on a chessboard. By the end of the day, everything would be over. He opened his laptop and started filling out paperwork. For him, it was second nature. He was an engineer, a man used to structure and precision. Everything had to be prepared. He filed for divorce, and within hours a confirmation email landed in his inbox. She had no idea how quickly it would move. But James was ready. He had accounted for everything. Over the last couple of days, he had already arranged the sale of their car. The process was so smooth and emotionless that Emily, freshly showered and distracted, never even noticed how the world around them was collapsing. James had transferred the remaining funds from their joint account to his new private one. Now, he had everything he needed for a fresh start. But above all, he had something he had not felt in years: freedom. Emily seemed unaware of any of this until she walked into the room and saw James at the desk, his expression focused, calmly completing forms on his computer. She did not immediately understand what was happening, but her instincts told her something was wrong. "James, are you out of your mind?" she snapped, walking up to him and yanking the documents from his hands. "We agreed we'd handle this like adults." James did not flinch. He kept his eyes on the screen, unfazed. "You're not even giving me a chance to explain," she shouted, a trace of desperation creeping into her voice. "You love me. Why are you doing this?" She tried to catch his eye, but he would not look at her. He could not look at her lies any longer. With every word she said, every twitch of her mouth, James understood more clearly that there had never been real love. Nothing about their relationship had been genuine. He no longer believed in her tears. He no longer believed in her voice. "You've already taken what you wanted," he said at last, not lifting his gaze. His voice was calm and steady, but unmistakably final. "You got everything from him. So go on. Keep getting what you want. Just not for me. Her face shifted. She was not prepared for that. Silence fell between them, and her eyes lost their spark. She took a step back, as if physically hit by his words. She opened her mouth to say something. Anything, but nothing came. So that's it? She asked softly, hoping to hear a sliver of doubt. Something she could work with. But there was nothing. James stood up and approached her. He looked directly into her eyes, without hatred, without regret. Like he was looking at someone he had once known, but no longer recognized. Yes, that's it, he said. You're not the woman I fell in love with. And this is no longer my life. You made your choice. I'm no longer part of it. We're done. She stood motionless, unable to respond. Her mouth moved slightly, but the words would not come. She kept staring at him, as if still hoping he would change his mind, that this was all just a nightmare, a phase, something temporary. But James was gone. The man who would have forgiven, who would have fought for her, that man no longer existed. He gathered his things slowly, deliberately, and headed toward the door, leaving her standing alone in the room, a room that had once been a home. But now, it was nothing but ruins. Emily stayed behind, staring into space. She wanted to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words had no power anymore. She just stood there, unable to grasp the reality unfolding around her. Weeks passed since the day James filed for divorce. Time stretched out before him like a slow-motion scene. He was in no rush. He did not try to rebuild his life overnight, but the changes were clear. The walls he had lived behind for so many years were slowly crumbling, and with them, the version of the world he had once believed in began to fade. James joined the gym. It was not a spontaneous decision. He knew he needed something to keep his hands and mind busy, some way to escape the heavy silence that threatened to consume him. Every day, he walked into the gym, starting with simple exercises and gradually increasing the intensity. The clank of iron, the burn in his muscles, the shortness of breath. It was like therapy. It stripped away everything he had been holding on to. Each drop of sweat felt like a small release. He felt his body come alive again. The heaviness of the past began to lift. He was no longer a man bound to his old life. He was becoming someone else. Stronger, more self-assured, free from the weight of memories that had dragged him down. Then, without much thought, he enrolled in English classes. Why now? He was not sure. Maybe it was his way of proving to himself that life did not end with divorce, that there were still things to learn, things to conquer. He studied vocabulary, grammar, practiced pronunciation, and strangely, this too began to pull him to the surface. Understanding, growth. It gave him something new to chase. He no longer pitted himself. He was living, and for now that was enough. He rented a small apartment on the edge of the city. It was modest, tucked inside an old building, with minimal furniture and no unnecessary clutter. But it was his, a place to start over. No grand dreams, no big expectations, just freedom. The freedom to do whatever he wanted, to live without compromise. It was not loneliness, it was liberation, the kind he had feared for years, only to realize he'd been afraid of losing something that had never truly been his. Sometimes Emily would text him. Short, hollow messages like nothing had happened. How are you? So this is really final? Sometimes she added that she missed him, but James never replied. He felt no need to. She expected him to answer, to give her a way back into his life. She could not accept that he had erased her. She kept trying, hoping the door would open again. But James was no longer standing there, waiting. Her messages came and went unread. He did not open a single one. He had no use for her words. He no longer believed in promises. He no longer believed in her sincerity. Whatever she had to offer now, he had already moved past it. Every time he heard the ping of another message, his heart remained still. Those words meant nothing. She could say anything, but it was already too late. Whatever she had to offer belonged to a life he had already buried. Time passed, and James dove deeper into his new world. Step by step, he became the man he had always meant to be. He was no longer afraid of silence, no longer afraid of solitude. The only thing he feared now was falling into the same trap again, the one he had built with his own hands. Now, when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw someone unchained, someone whole, and that was all he needed. Emily, faced with silence, kept reaching out, but James knew there was no message that could bring him back. He had erased her, and in doing so, he reclaimed his life. She was part of his past now, a past that held no power over him. He was free, and that freedom had nothing to do with being alone. James sat at a small table in a quiet cafe tucked on the corner of a quiet street. It was a place he had never been before, but something about it felt right the moment he walked in. No flash, no pretense, just warmth. The kind of warmth that reminded him of home, or at least what home should have felt like. The walls were soft in color, the wooden tables warm but clean, and the lighting gentle, like a late afternoon sun that never quite fades. He glanced at the old-fashioned clock hanging above the counter. Time was moving forward, but for the first time in a long while, he did not feel trapped by it. In front of him sat a cup of tea. He did not drink it right away. He simply sat there, feeling the space around him, thinking that maybe, just maybe, luck had finally found him again. He felt it, the return of life. Not the one he had known before, but a new one, different. One he was easing into, step by step. No rush, no fear. Just quiet confidence. Across from him sat a woman. Not a model, not a showstopper, but someone whose presence felt real. There was something vulnerable and honest about her. Something open and calm. The sunlight spilling to the window touched her face, and her eyes, kind and steady, met his without judgment. She did not demand explanations. She did not fish for details. She simply sat there, existing with him in the moment. And for James, that was enough. He noticed her stillness, the soft authenticity of her smile, the way she did not perform, did not pretend. It was refreshing, pure without baggage or performance. There were no hidden games, no rehearsed lines. Just two people, sitting in a cafe, with no need to dig up the past. I was married, James said gently, like confirming something more for himself than for her. But now, I'm free. She did not ask questions. She did not ask why it ended, or how bad it got, or who did what. She simply nodded. She accepted it as a fact, not a tragedy. You've changed, she said with a soft voice, not accusing, not sad, just observing. Like someone noticing the weather shift from winter to spring. James looked at her, and something inside him relaxed. For the first time in what felt like years, he smiled, not politely, not because it was expected, but genuinely. She did not ask for explanations. She did not press him for stories. She simply shared the space with him. And that was more than enough. He reached for his tea and took a sip. The warmth filled him, not just physically, but emotionally. The taste was ordinary, but in that moment, it was perfect. He looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, light and slow, covering the street in a soft white blanket. The snowflakes danced beneath the glow of the street lamps, quiet and beautiful, like a dream unfolding right in front of him. He sat there, watching it all, feeling the warmth from the cup, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt peace. Life does not end with betrayal. It begins with honesty. He was not ready to forgive the past, but he was ready to walk forward, without anger, without regret, without the weight of what had been. Just the quiet knowing that everything he had survived had led him here. And in that small, quiet cafe on that snowy evening, James understood something simple and profound. His life, his real life, was just beginning.